Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and welcome everyone to tonight's mastermind and webinar, Securing a Smart Location, with my very close friend and expert in the space finding and negotiation process for securing a smart location, that Reed Wrisley. So, Reed, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am going to allow you to present yourself and tell us a little bit more about your background. And then we're going to go over our agenda and what we have prepared for you, because I want to dive deep into what a lot of doctors are struggling with, or are concerned about when it comes to finding and securing a smart location as they jump into the process of starting their very first practices. So, Reed, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you just came from vacation, so thank you for your time tonight.
No, thank you for having me as always. It's always great to connect and outreach to everybody. So,
Beautiful. So, what we have today in store for everyone that is joining us, and for all those of you who are joining us live, thank you for being with us tonight, because you could have been anywhere. We look forward to sharing with you some insights, and towards the end of the webinar, I'm going to make sure that we open up the space so that you can ask Reed questions about your specific situation. And but our goal tonight is to teach you how you are going to secure your dream dental practice location with Reed. So we're going to be asking him a lot of questions, and we're going to be breaking down for you the process so that you can do this the right way. Now, what we have in store for you is we want to allow you to understand. So we're going to really take Reed's time to learn and understand the key terms of a lease agreement. How is that important? What is inside the negotiating process for a favorable terms for you as a first-time practice owner? And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the common pitfalls to avoid in lease negotiations, or even when it comes to securing a smart location, right? And towards the end, we are going to open up the floor so that you can ask your specific questions and seek expert advice from Reed from Practice Consulting Group. So let me see. Let me see. My name, for those of you who don't know me, it's Maritza Duran. I am the founder of MDent Consulting. And my passion is to help dentists who are first time practice owners through their journey of deciding to leave their associate positions to start their own practices and running it efficiently. And I rely on a lot of experts and a team of advisors to help me through this process, to allow my clients to really have the benefits of selecting a smart location. And Reed is one of those individuals that I work with and I trust. And then, Reed, tell us a little bit about yourself, and so that people know why it is so important to listen and stick till the end through this webinar tonight.
sure, no, absolutely. Name is Reed Wrisley with Practice Real Estate Group, as you can see. I have been in real estate in and around New York area for 16 years, and I've been on the healthcare side for about 6.5 years. Started out initially in residential real estate for about 9.5 years, and when I came over to Practice Real Estate Group, um, it was definitely a big shift. I'm sure a lot of people have purchased a home or multiple homes. It's completely different ballgame. Nothing is really similar. I always call it kind of apples to giraffes. Like it's not even a food group when it comes to commercial leasing or purchasing, as opposed to just buying or leasing a regular home. So, there's many challenges that will come along where it's individualized. I've never really run into the same situations twice, even though I've placed over 70, 80 practices in probably about 8 states now at this time. Um, it's just a fun challenge, and I love working with my doctors to help them through the process because I know it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, things that they'll do in their lifetime. So I just want to make sure I'm setting them up for success in the long term play.
Awesome. So one of the things, just to start off, I just want to put things into perspective. I had a situation once with a dentist about 5 years ago when I had just started working as a consultant. And I always share this story about how one of the very first clients that I helped start her practice had a friend that she said to me when she was opening her office. She said, Maritza, Dr. B's opening. We were, classmates. We're going through this journey together. And you're helping me start my practice, but I would also like for her to speak to you so that you can help her as well. And when I reached out to Dr. B, she just, she basically told me, I'm okay. I think, I have my in-laws are in real estate, and they helped me find my space. And that was one of those pitfalls and one of those things that led to her during the COVID time. She ended up closing her practice. And I specifically touched on this subject, like there were so many other things. I spoke to her a year later after I had lunch with my doctor, and she had built her practice from zero to $1 million in revenue. And she said, Dr. B is still struggling. She did open her practice. We started our journey together, but she's really struggling. You should definitely connect with her and speak to her. When I got back on the phone with Dr. B, she's like, yes, this is what I had done for securing my lease. This is what I had done for hiring the staff. This is what I had done for enrolling with insurance companies. This is so everything on the to-do list for setting up a strong foundation for your practice or securing a smart location had not been checked for this doctor. And that led to her failing as a business owner, failing as an individual, because when we are unable to fulfill and we make the decision to start a business, a lot of businesses fail. And I always say that success is where planning and opportunity meet. And she had the opportunity to seek advice, but she trusted. And a lot of times, this is where a lot of us as first-time business owners, we feel that people are out there to get us. And so we're better off trusting the people that we already have a relationship with. And in this case, Dr. B had her in-laws that are trustworthy individuals who genuinely and to their credit, they do care about, our family do care about us. But one of the things and one of the reasons why I encourage doctors to work with a trusted, real estate broker such as Reed, and I have other really great people that are out there to serve you, is because we don't know what we don't know. And as much as securing a space is important, the minor details, the fine prints, and all of these things, it's something that it's new to you and potentially to your loved ones that have the best intentions to support you, but they're not equipped with the knowledge and the understanding to do so. And so for me, I wanted to share just to give you guys the foundation, because a lot of you, and you can let me know in the comments, how many of you have been told, let me know in the comments, by someone, let's just go ahead and work with someone that it's a relative or a friend that it's in the real estate space. Let us know in the comment, and I'll let Reed start to walk us through how to avoid getting into a situation where you are setting up yourself for failure. Let's go over some of the steps and the questions that a lot of dentists have and that I want Reed to answer for us. So let's start off with, understanding what an LOI is, or letter of intent. So Reed, do you mind taking us through what this process is, what it means, what's included, and tell our doctors, teach us the whole process and the very basic concepts of what an LOI is.
Sure. So it's a negotiating tool that is non-binding. You could do it 6 times if you needed to, obviously more or less. Ideally, you don't want to, but you keep going until you get it right. Sometimes situations just don't end up working out for many different reasons that are too lengthy to go into. We could be here all night until tomorrow or the next day. But anyways, in its simplest form, it's just a negotiating tool that we try to put our best foot forward to try to make it work out in the end for you.
Now, what are some of the things that, if I'm a dentist and I'm just, getting started and I see this for the first time, right? Like, what
Sure.
are some of the things that are included on an LOI?
Sure. So there are many different variations that could be brought to the table if you're purchasing um, an existing building or, an individual or a condo. When you deal with co-ops in Manhattan, that's a different story than purchasing a condo anywhere else. Whether it's leasing or even a ground up project, there's always going to be different variables that you have to run into. And, you know, essentially,
I
there's
I know you sent me this before because we sent this for our doctor, and it would be interesting for us to review it together, just so that, because it's so interesting when we do this for the doctors, and to them it just sounds like another language. So I'm going to see if I'm able to pull it up, just so that, because you do this on a day-to-day basis, and I look at it and I'm like, he knows, this is what we need to do. But for our audience, I think it would be interesting. So I'm going to try to share a document of like what you propose typically on an LOI, and you can just walk us through what it means,
Oh,
if you don't
okay,
mind.
sure. No, this was a surprise. That's great. So you're using
Let me see.
real live
Is
action
this,
stuff.
do you see this here now?
Gotcha. Sure.
Okay. So you have here, here are the key terms that we're proposing on the letter of intent, or the LOI.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So
Are you,
yeah, no, I could see it. So basically, I try to summarize and take all of my doctors through step by step, saying why and what is important and why we're doing it. It's not just like a 1 or 2 page letter that works on the rent and the tenant improvement allowance and the free rent. Those are obviously some of the biggest points, but there's many other things when it comes to, you know, trying to get reserved parking, trying to get better signage, trying to get signage at all. But essentially, what you have in front of us is, let me see. So yeah, basically, we're asking about like when the space is going to be delivered and how the space is going to be delivered. If there's going to be a demising wall, sometimes when it's just an empty shell of a space and it's a 15,000 square foot building, it's literally just dirt and walls on the outside. And we're taking 2,000, 2,500 square feet. I want to make sure that what we're proposing is trying to put as much on the landlord to take care of and pay for. We ask about the HVAC language, just to make sure it's not a 30-year-old unit and you have to replace a potentially $20,000 to $40,000 unit within your first couple of months of opening for business, especially after you've built out a space, whatever it may be. Ask him when the lease actually commences. The tenant construction period, which is obviously one of the most important ones, just because when you have to submit permits and designs to the town, that could be pretty lengthy. I've seen it go, 8, 9 months, unfortunately. Just stuff that's out of our control. Some silly city officials that just take their time and have no regard for small businesses like yourself. But yeah, I mean, we ask about like the personal guarantee. There's always going to be some form of a guarantee if you're doing a startup, or if you're opening your 50th location and there's a corporate guarantee. We always try to get you a longer lease because it is a long-term play. I've done 10 and 15-year leases. But I've limited the personal guarantee down to just a couple of years, just in the worst case scenario, or if the person wants to sell their practice and go retire down to Australia or Costa Rica or something.
What would you say would be like the 5 most, I mean, for me, that some of the pitfalls that I've seen in some leases in the past has had to do with having exclusive rights to the site, where sometimes the lease terms of how many years you're going to be in there, because you want to be able to have a long-term commitment with the landlord, but also I feel that one of the pitfalls is the having exclusive rights to the space. Can you elaborate more about like why that is important, and how that is implemented into, like, so that when you're working with a landlord that is used to probably working with retail, and other types of businesses rather than a healthcare provider, and those minor details and differences that, like from the landlord's perspective, they may be looking at it as just another lease. But for us in the medical and the dental field, it's not like we can just grab a dental chair and move, right? So, and also competition is super important. So can you tell us, a little bit more about, the importance of that, and how, you help ensure that they're protected in that sense?
Sure. No, absolutely. So of course we always try for an exclusive, and it'll depend on how big the building is and how much space we're taking. If it's a skyscraper that's 150,000 square feet and we're renting 2,000 square feet, we won't really have much luck getting that. But, generally speaking, out in the suburbs, I would say, obviously New York is its own entity, or, any city really in general. But, out in the suburbs, it's a 20, 50,000 square foot building. Even if you're taking 2,000 to 3,000 square feet, we want to be the exclusive provider of their use, whether, it's an oral surgeon, endo, GP. We always try to push for that just because it is important. We're trying to keep competitors out. So we try to stick as hard as possible to that.
Beautiful. Let me go ahead. And so from a landlord's perspective, how do you define landlords, and how do you think they view our, providers and industry as a whole?
Sure. So I always find it easier to deal with owners that have worked in medical. It really is its own entity, just because there are a lot of nuances. And, I would say dental is even more difficult to get into a building than medical providers, let alone, a traditional IT office or a law firm or something like that. Just because it's very intrusive to the building. You might have to or drill when you plumb every operatory. So it's a little bit more disruptive, and a lot of landlords who have never dealt in the healthcare space don't really realize that until you're in it. So, we'll always try to vet the landlords. I mean, a lot of them, more often than not, I would say they're generally understanding that it's a bit more expensive to build a dental office than it is a traditional office. There's a longer term play than, a 5, 6, 7 year lease or something like that. Not to say that we can't do that, of course, but the longer that you're telling the landlord that you're ideally going to be there, the better deal and the more likely they're going to work with you.
And would you say that the industry as a whole it's an attractive one, right, for landlords? Just because I feel that after COVID, a lot of real what's the word I'm looking for?
Real estate spaces, maybe?
Like retail spaces. Real estate. English is my second language, everyone knows.
No worries.
But yeah, so like a lot of stores and clothing stores and a lot of places are just going out of business. And so that is where the leverage is, I feel, for us in the dental space, where the industry just continues to grow and it's very steady and secure for us as a tenant, right? Like it costs them more. It's a little more complicated for them just because they are not used to probably dealing with like all the drilling and the plumbing that goes into play for like setting up a dental unit and all these other things. But overall, in comparison to a lot of the other potential tenants, you know, like in the retail space, I think the dental and medical are a lot more uh you know, it's been at least my experience, and I'm not in the commercial space, but you can speak more to that. But I feel that it's a more attractive type of tenant for them to have. So there are instances where there are areas that are being developed and they specifically want to ensure that they bring on someone that that it's in the medical or dental space. So
Sure.
that's, you know, so that's great. So now we understand a little bit about what's included on a letter of intent. What are some of the most important pieces for us as first time practice owners as we're securing our location, and we can gauge a little bit on the understanding of the, you know, what the landlords are thinking so that we can come in and put our best foot forward. Now I think that, you know, we have had this conversation before about like what are some of the key areas that we want to touch on these things, and I said, you know, like there are steps and there are certain tips and questions that our doctors are always asking.
Mhm.
And so, you know, like I want to say, and you can go through this, you know, like you can take over the slides if you're able to. I'm happy to moderate it and ask you the question, or if you want to just take it from here, you're more than welcome to do so.
Sure.
But yeah, so like one of the things that you've brought up to me a lot is like, you know, doctors need to understand their space while they're negotiating the lease. And so the question is, you know, like, should a blank space or like a empty shell space be negotiated the same way as a second generation or a place that it's already plumbed? Like, how do a dentist that is looking at these two different options gain, you know, leverage and an understanding on how to navigate the lease negotiation depending on their situation?
Sure. No, absolutely. So an empty shell, you know, I think blank space is perfectly said just because it's literally a couple of poles and, you know, there's not even wiring in place. Um, you definitely want to treat that differently just because is there already power to the space? Are there water lines? Are there sewer lines in a retail space? It's a little bit different than an empty shell of like an office building. There's that stuff's going to already be in place. Um, so yeah, even a second generation office space, because you know more often than not, it's pretty stinking hard to get a second generation dental office. It's obviously not impossible, but um, you know, even if you need to move plumbing a foot in each operatory,
Mm,
it's almost sometimes better to take a sledgehammer to the space than to take a scalpel to the space.
I
You
see.
know, like when you're trying, I've actually heard this from a few different contractors that when you're trying to work with what's in place, if you do find a second generation dental office, if you're not really taking pretty much what's there, and of course it's circumstantial, it's not always, but um, you know, it might be more costly to work with what's in there than to just completely demo the space.
Interesting.
Yeah,
And
so it's kind of wild. I never would have thought that, but like I said, you know, somebody who designed an office in, you know, the 90s or early 2000s and it's 20, 30-year old second generation space, their waiting room's probably twice the size of what you need now. They might have had filing
mm,
system areas where, you know, that's wasted space now. You could probably turn that into, you know, two extra operatories at this point. And not to say that you can't do partial work, of course, but you know, you have to treat it differently just because if you're going into a retail space and it's a brand new building, nothing's ever been there, you're going to be the first tenant, or even if you're, you know, the second tenant, there's just nothing in place. Um, you know, something you might want to keep an eye out for, which we would know, and I would have never known this had I not gone into the healthcare space, even having 10 years almost of real estate experience, is there duct work in place? Is there an HVAC in place? On something that has 5 to 8 operatories, or that can fit 5 to 8 operatories, and call it 1,800 to 2,500 square feet roughly. That could be $60,000 to $90,000 alone on just HVAC and duct work. So that is with a blank space. And then if you need to bring power to it, it's just very costly to keep an eye out for. So if there was a business in place, even if it's non-dental, most of the infrastructure like that is going to be in place, so you can push on other points of your negotiation rather than focusing on trying to get a $40,000 HVAC and a $30,000 ducting in place.
Okay, so if you guys have any questions, because I know that there is a lot that we're learning as we're going through this, save them and let us know in the comments so that we can get to your questions during the Q&A, because this is very interesting, and this is information that I'm a student here myself. So if I'm understanding, the landlord looks at it, and the power of negotiating the lease there is definitely a difference on how you approach the negotiations when you're dealing with an empty space versus already a space that has some infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, okay. So the next question is, understanding the process and the timeline. Like, what would you consider is the most pressing part of negotiating a lease for a dentist who is a first-time practice owner?
Sure. I mean, obviously there are so many different levels and different big points, but that's a great question. I mean, I would say one of the more pressing, maybe not the most, but one of the more pressing, I would say, would be the sublease and assignment section. That's usually one of the touchier points when it comes to an owner, because they don't want to rent to you and then have you turn around and rent to some random person that they didn't vet. Whatever the case may be, even if you sell your practice in 7 or 8 years, you don't want to be on the hook for the remainder of their, your original lease term. So a lot of landlords will put some pretty big speed bump pushback into that, or just try to reject it in total and say, let the attorneys take care of it. I always try to hammer out as much as possible. Just try to, put a couple paragraphs together. I think that's one of our lengthier portions of what we try to cover for our doctors, just because, again, somebody wants to retire in 5 years, they're not personally guaranteeing it anymore, and they could just get out of it, even though they signed a 10-year lease.
I see. So these are the aspects of the lease that the landlord is trying to protect themselves.
Yeah, because if a landlord's giving you 8 months free rent to build out your space and open up your business, they're always going to be more front end relaxed / friendly, let's call it.
I see.
Not to say that they, have silly, huge bumps towards the end or anything like that, but they do try to work with you up front. Most of them are the better ones, I would say. And then they think they're going to make their money back and start making their money, because it is a business towards the middle and the end of the lease. So if you sign a 10-year lease and they give you 8 months free, and they give you, call it $100,000 of tenant improvement allowance to help build out your space, where literally the owner just hands you a check. Well, not hands you a check, but it's a little bit more in depth than that. Let's just call it that. They'll kick in $100,000 to help you build out your space. If your rent is $50,000, $70,000 a year for the first year or two, the landlord wants to start making money back probably between months 12 and 24. So if you leave after 3 or 4 years, even though you signed a 10-year lease, it's not a good investment for the owner. So, they obviously want you there as long as possible, and they want to try to get their hooks in, which is understandable, but we want to try to limit that and try to get you an out in the off chance of anything happening.
Got it. And so what I'm understanding is, and you guys can definitely post your questions on the chat so that I can rephrase them in a, if you're going through this personally and you have any specific questions, we're going to open the Q&A in just a little bit. But is this where, because one of our questions I think is understanding, I want to stick to this question and elaborate a little bit more on this, maybe so that
Sure.
it doesn't, I don't miss that, my thought. So what I'm understanding is that when you are negotiating the lease, you need to have a good understanding of the amount that the landlord is giving you up front, and then how they're looking at the deal in terms of their long-term, return on investment, if you will. And so what I'm understanding is that they're going to make their money within months 12 and to 24. And
Yeah.
so they're going to potentially push back on, one, the guarantee, and two, on the sublease. So what would you recommend would be the best practices for approaching this scenario? And let's just say, I mean, I highly doubt that anyone that is on this call, unless they have a vision for like adding associates. But if you're adding an associates that is going to be working under you, you don't necessarily need to add them to your lease because they're working as an associate for you. But if you, let's say, you want to relocate, or you just want to create a sublease, we have a deal now that it's a sublease, and they've changed the times several times, and it's in a co-op, and they have to have like the board meetings and all these things. We hired a team about a month ago, and the team cannot access the premises because of that. And so subleases tend to be tedious because when a doctor, it's old or it's retiring and they own the building, or they want to stay on but they want to do a sublease, it gets a little bit complicated. So I am going through this process as we speak. But generally speaking, for those of you who are just getting your empty space, and you're looking at they're giving you tenant allowing improvement money up front, and you're negotiating the rent, the increments, and all of these things, be mindful. I correct me if I'm wrong. If you're going to have some if you're going to need to probably compromise on the sublease, or is it standard that we do get them to agree to a sublease, to agreeing for a sublease after a certain period?
Sure. So in theory, yes. We always want them to agree to that, because down the line, if and when you sell your practice, again, you don't want to be on the hook for Dr. X or Dr. Y coming in, because you don't know what they're going to be doing. And you also don't want to be so limited where the owner makes a lot of ridiculous requests to try to get you to still remain on the hook for the lease, so to speak. So, it's a tough question, because you deal with 1,000 landlords, you'll get 10,000 different responses on a letter of intent. There's never really there's a template, of course, but you truly never know how and where they're going to push back on what you propose. So, there has to be some balance in there. It's like if somebody's asking $40 a square foot for a rent and we go in at 25, they probably won't even respond to us. They would barely take my call. So I usually don't suggest doing that. Even if the space has been available for 5 or 8 years, you'd be surprised. A lot of owners stick to their guns for the most part, but there's always room, and it's always the entire picture and the entire offer. It's never just one thing that's singled out. It's never just the rent, just the free rent, just the potential, tenant improvement allowance. It's really a whole fishbowl of, a bunch of different things that need to really come together to make the space work.
Beautiful. And that leads me to my next question before I let some of our attendees post their questions on the chat, and you can, share anything else that may be coming to mind as I'm asking you these. I get this a lot. Like, my friend was able to get this much in tenant improvements, or my friend's rent is this much. So, can we get what my friend is getting? Or, like, I have a
Right.
friend, and you're like, what's the context? What's the information? So one of the tips that you share with me offline as we were preparing this was, like, it's important that you, as a first time practice owners, you understand your geographic area, and that you stick to what is true to your particular location and your market. So the question is then, are most negotiations the same within a specific area? And how do you navigate, um, those differences in the marketplace, so that we can remain focused and get the best possible deal to secure our space within, within that particular geographic area?
Sure. So, unfortunately, they're not the same within a specific area.
Even within a specific area.
Yeah, like it's pretty wild, So again, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens aside, those are just, they're actually fun to work with. I always try to beat up the landlords as much as possible, but those can drastically change in terms of their asking rents for something that's similar. I've seen stuff where, once we start targeting areas and looking at properties within a specific area that we've identified for the doctor's needs, you could see something in a city that is $60-$70 per square foot, and then something a half a block away is $125 a square foot for something that's really similar. Nothing, too drastic. It's not like it's hidden behind a building in an alleyway, and then the other one's a great corner space. It's like literally they could be 50 yards away and it can almost be double the rent. So, city aside, in the suburbs, similar, but just not as wide ranging. It's like if you're looking at something that's $25-$35 per square foot, it's never really going to be the same, just because there's going to be different. If you're taking a retail space in any state, really, the landlord charges their tenants the pass-through cost of, it's commonly referred to as a triple net lease, where
I see.
you pay the taxes, the insurance, and the common area maintenance, whether it's snow removal or, trimming of the hedges, whatever it may be. They usually pass that through. And, in any town, it could be $7 a square foot in extra expenses. I've seen up to 25, probably 25 is one of the higher that I've seen. And that's just for the expenses. That's not even the base rent. So every building is going to be completely different, and there's just not really going to be similar negotiations on that.
What would you say is so one of the what strategy or tip do you suggest for figuring out, what the normal ranges are for your specific area in this situation, where you're getting your friends to tell you, one of my colleagues is doing this, and it's not the same geographic area. So what are some of, like, the strategies and best practices for making sure that, your lease is being secured properly, and that you're getting the best possible, rent and that good stuff?
So I would say stay far away from the doctor Facebook groups. Everybody has
That's a strategy.
Yeah, no. It's highly suggested. I jokingly say that, and I always say it's kind of the WebMD equivalent. Instead of going to the actual doctor and me diagnosing myself on WebMD, I try to avoid that. But when you're looking for the practice, you really have to take it, or excuse me, when you're looking to open a practice, you really have to take it in stride as it comes along. I've had, like you're saying, similar situations where they say, my friend did this, and it was recently, it was like somewhat close. I've also had people say, like, oh, I know a lot of my doctors want to initially consider purchasing a building. And if you can fund it and make it work, of course, that's a great option. But, I've had people be like, oh, I don't understand why it's so different. And then I start digging around and found out somebody bought a dilapidated building 15 years ago, where it's like, even if they bought it 3 years ago, it was a different market, even if it was in the same town. There's never really going to be a similarity, with doctors even opening in the same town. I've worked with a doctor who was up in Westchester in New York, and we got a great deal for her, and we negotiated a lot. It depends on where it is, but some owners don't really like to give money. So they'll give it in the form of free rent. So you try to, get a high amount of that just to kind of offset some of the initial cost. But, I remember she came to me, and there was a doctor in town where she was like, oh, he's getting tenant improvement allowance on a similar situation, this and that. And after digging around and finding out more information about it, she was a startup. The person she was referring to had 2 locations, one in Manhattan and one in the town in Westchester. The one that he had in Westchester, he'd been there for 13 to 15 years, so he was already an established doctor, had great numbers to show. So, an owner more likely than not will want to work with somebody who's already been established, because they know they have a track record as opposed to the startup. So, that part was left out or just never thought of, and not to the doctor's fault. She was great. And, it's good to get an understanding that, each and every time you negotiate or look for a space, it's going to be different than what you've heard. Just because, again, the classic thing of like the Facebook groups, and it's not to talk poorly on it. It's obviously there for a great reason, and I'm sure a lot of it is resourceful and helpful. But just because somebody opened a practice 1 or 2 years ago, 30 miles away, and that's what happened for them, is going to be the same situation for you. It could be, a landlord that only owns that one building. It's their last space. They just want to rent it because it's their family money or their family trust. And then the one that we're taking, the owner owns 10 million square feet across 40 states. They own big retail centers. They're a real estate trust that's publicly traded. They're going to have different criteria. So if you really like that space and you want to make it work, you can still get a great deal. It just might be different than what your friend told you,
because of the context and the difference in the situation of the landlord, and also your capacity as a coming in, what you have to offer. So in negotiations, I always say it's something that works both ways. And so what would you say it's more important? Because I think this is where a lot of times we are faced with this situation where you either want to, because part of the negotiations is like, you want to be able to have good, as a startup, a good starting point of negotiating like the tenant improvements. So what would you say is more important or impactful in the lifetime of the lease for a startup dentist? Should they focus more on improving the tenant improvement allowance, or managing the terms of the rate of the rent, the base rent? And how do landlords view it, so that we can create a strategy for our doctors?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So I would say it's going to be up to my doctor to kind of see what's the most important for you, and it'll depend on what the space is. If you get an office space, traditionally it's going to be less rent, and sometimes more favorable on tenant improvement allowance. Again, it's circumstantial, but I've had doctors say, I would like more money. Let's go up on the rent from what the asking rent was, just so we can get more money up front from the owner. If it's a $50 or $60 per square foot retail space, We're not going to say to the owner, hey, we want X amount of money, let's go up to 65 or 70. When the rent is more reasonable and manageable, and they want a lesser monthly, cost.
Operational costs. So
Yeah.
I always tell to my clients, we have our startup costs and we have a budget that we need to follow based on the financing and how much you're able to borrow from the banks to launch your practice. And then we have our ongoing operational costs. So to divide and conquer, we have to create what's important for us. So what I'm hearing you say is that, again, it's on the case by case basis, and you need to look at what your monthly cost is going to look like, and if this is something that it's manageable, and based on how much money you're borrowing up front and the type of practice that you want to build, based on the budget, maybe getting some of that tenant allowance increase by the landlord would be of more of a priority for you in the short term. Okay.
And it'll depend on the size too. If I'm working with a single practitioner that's leasing a 1,600 square foot 4-operatory office space and the rent is very manageable, that's going to be different than somebody who's building out almost twice the size in retail. They're going for 2,200 to 3,000 square feet. It's just that much more space to build out. So they might need more capital up front from the owner. So, that's really what it comes down to.
Makes sense. So guys, if you have any questions, this is the time. I asked Reed all of my questions, but this was meant for you. So anyone, I have some messages here on the private chat. I think this was with Dr. Park. I'm just going to go to the regular comments. Does anyone have any questions for Reed? Tell us about where you are in your journey. What questions are pressing you right now in terms of your lease? Do you have any concerns or questions? This is the time before we wrap up and we go through our last couple of minutes here. We want to be, I'm grateful to have you all joining us today, but I also want to make sure that you take a lot, that you learn a lot, and that you're able to walk away with something to implement tomorrow for your practice. Now, Reed, one of the things that I wanted to point out is as we are going through the process of securing a space, tell us and just so that we understand, because we go through this process all the time, but for the doctors, especially for those who are new or someone that watches the replay later on who wasn't able to make it tonight, the process of reaching out to someone to start finding the location, securing that location, and walk us through the steps. I think that, let me see if I don't have any questions. If you guys have any questions, you can post them through the chat, because I just want to basically go through the slides and wrap up so that Reed can tell us more or less the steps of the process of how the lease negotiation takes place from the LOI to the execution and the timeline.
Sure. Yeah. So, I would say a letter of intent can take 1 to 2 months. I would say that's probably a good average, just because you never know the next person's situation. They could be traveling, like the owner could be traveling, or they have a holiday for a couple days, out of the month, whatever it may be. Like we're going through Passover right now. So, I would say a good time frame for a letter of intent negotiation would be 1 to 2 months. I've seen it go in a week. That's very rare, but I have seen it. I've seen it go 5 and 6 months, just because there's a lot of different points that we're still trying to push, trying to paint the picture to ownership, to say why and what we're trying to do. You can also delay a little bit. You can build in some delays as well when we're trying to design the space behind the scenes, and we need a little more time through our equipment reps or our contractor, architect, whatever it may be. So I would say 1 to 2 months is probably a good time frame for a letter of intent.
For letter of intent. And once we have the letter of intent that has been accepted, then what happens next?
Sure. So once the bigger bullet points of the letter of intent have been accepted, then you would get a dental specific attorney. Um, I always suggest dental everything just because
Hmm.
everybody knows an attorney, you know,
Like everyone knows a
brothers.
realtor, right?
Yeah, exactly. Brothers, sisters, mom's cousin is an attorney, and they can read law. But the only problems I really ever run into at the lease, because once you're at lease, it never really falls through. I think that's one of the comforting.
And the lease is somewhat, and we have a question from Dr. Rangwala that we'll get to in just a second. But one of the things that I have learned is that the lease is usually what the building typically has for their standard, like they have their lease, right? But you need to have an attorney that after the business terms and some of the things for you dental specific needs, right? And your requirements and your criteria has to look at their templated lease as they drafted, including a lot of the things that they've agreed to on the lease, just to make sure that all that other, language from their attorneys and how they protect themselves are reviewed and screened and vetted by a dental specific attorney. You don't want to skip this process and just make sure that you have, because I did hear the story of a dentist who the building was sold or something to that extent, and their office was like 4 or 5 years in, and there was not something to protect them from, like the building being relocated or something like that. So those are things that as you're building your first practice, you want to build your legacy for yourself and for your patients. And it takes a lot for you to just make the decision to start, go through this entire process of getting a team of advisors, getting the lending, getting all of these things, for you to just learn later on that someone that, because they weren't dental specific, an attorney, that some of these terms were not negotiated properly. Let's get to Dr. Rangwala's question. She says, I'm looking into buying an existing practice. As for the lease, any clauses that may prevent me from renting the space for a day or two to a specialist?
Sure. No, that's a great question. There shouldn't be. I mean, obviously, you'd have to see the lease. There's definitely some funky language that can be written in. So you never really know until you actually see it. But generally speaking, that's not necessarily subletting. That's almost like bringing in your own workers who are W-2 or 1099. So you shouldn't really run into any issues with that. But again, you'd have to refer to that specific lease.
So I'm assuming she's referring to renting the space or potentially chairs, when she's not there. So
Yeah.
so unless they're going to build their own brand and they're going to be promoting and things like that, I think that if they're going to be, even if they're doing a 1099 in my experience, and they're they shouldn't be included in the lease because they're not
Yeah.
taking ownership of like any liability or anything like that. But that's not to say that depending on the type of agreement that you have with this potential specialists, that it may require that you have take a look at your lease and have it reviewed by an attorney so that you can say if there's any language that needs to be and so in this case she would need to do an amendment. Is that what would take place, Reed?
Yeah, I mean, you just have to kind of paint the picture. At the end of the day, again, thinking from the owner's side, they don't want the next person assuming the entire lease.
Okay.
That's why they put the plugs in place from the get-go.
Okay.
So you shouldn't have any problems renting, a couple days a week. At the end of the day, you're still liable for the lease. So they don't want you bringing in a specialist that is, where you're just never in the business. I think that's really the spirit behind the sublease and assignment section. But if you just rent out a chair or two a couple days a week, that shouldn't be a problem. But again, refer to your lease.
Does that answer your question, Dr. Rangwala? We want to wrap up, and so why is it important for you to go through this process and ensure that that you take the time to do your due diligence, not listen to your peers and just focus on what is true in front of you. And by taking into context all of the details and things that we share today, you are able to secure a smart location, because at the end, you want to be able to have a happy team. You're going to want to be able to have your patients that are happy. I have appointed a real estate broker attorney to assist me,
Yeah,
who
I'm
will
actually
handle.
responding to that.
Okay, so I have appointed a real estate broker attorney to assist me, who will handle the lease negotiation after receiving the response from the landlord.
Yeah, I mean, I'll type it out as well. I was saying your attorney would negotiate the lease, definitely not your real estate broker. But hopefully your broker was able to bring up some good terms and stuff like that to um, have a lengthier letter of intent, just because that usually reduces
A
the
lot
cost.
of the negotiation on the attorney's side to save them the back and forth that sometimes can
Yeah,
lead to
the
the
attorney
higher
fees and
costs.
all that for sure. So it's like that's one of the things that my company kind of prides ourselves on is um, trying to reduce the eventual fees that you're going to incur through the lease. Just because a 2-page letter of intent might just cover the big nuts and bolts, not the nitty gritty stuff, which could be an 85-page lease. That could be a pretty costly hourly attorney fees. So the lengthier lease, the bigger points that are taken care of up front, really at no cost to the doctor. That's really the most important part. So hopefully that answers your question.
That's a great answer. And so at the end, we want our team to be happy long term. Longevity in the workforce, which is extremely important nowadays. We want our patients to be happy, but ultimately we want to build a legacy for ourselves and have life balance, balance. Like as first time business owners, one of the reasons why we say we want to quit our jobs and do our thing is because we feel like we are stuck, unable to do things the way that we want them in our careers or in our current workforce, whether you're working as an associate for corporate or for a private practice. But there are a lot of things that I always say, success is where planning and opportunity meet. If you are facing and you're at crossroads trying to figure out, do I start my own business or do I remain working as an associate, and you do follow your passion and your dream to start your practice, just do your due diligence and plan accordingly, so when an opportunity comes your way, you are prepared. So one of the things that I want to share is, one of our former clients together with Dr. Urbina. And this is Reed's contact information. If you're working with me, know that I am putting you in front of the best people to work in the marketplace. I work with Reed. I have great other brokers that work in certain areas where Reed is not covering those spaces. But at the end of the day, the important piece is you want to get on front and work with someone that has been there, that has done it. This is Reed's contact information. So make sure that if you have any questions or anything, that you reach out to him. This is, again, the result of working with someone and not following the friends and the cousins and the social media groups. And by putting a team of advisors together, it's the end result. And so you want to put yourself in that situation by reaching out to the right people. So I commend